culture is a group construct, coaching happens with individuals. So one of the traps that we might fall into is thinking that culture is everything. You know, it's certainly a factor, and it's a very important factor, but it's not everything. Not all Germans are the same. Not all Dutch people are the same. And as soon as we get into that kind of what I call lazy stereotyping, then we're going to be in just as much trouble as if we don't even think about culture. So we do need to think about the whole individual, which makes it complex, but also fills it with potential, I'd argue. We've touched upon this already. Sometimes an organisational culture can completely overwhelm a national culture, and these are three examples where people from all sorts of different nationalities are engaged in these particular organisations, and they define themselves to a degree more by the organisation than by their own national culture, or at least significantly more than you might expect. Some other complicated factors: hundreds of millions of expat workers. And by the way, who defines who's an expat and who's a migrant in this equation? A rather interesting question, I think. But there are lots of people moving around the world working in different cultures. Generation Y is creating an absolutely distinct, or broadly distinct, I should say, rather than absolutely, a broadly distinct culture of its own. Some people will argue, I've heard it said, that you can be 25 in Johannesburg and have more in common culturally with somebody who's 25 in Tokyo than with your parents, largely due to social media and the way that they look at the world. Lots of student migration, media influences we just sort of touched upon, and the fact is we do know a lot more about cultures thanks to things like TV. We do. Just picking up on Generation Y, they're a very interconnected culture because of social media, but they also have some very different attitudes, and there's not much question in most people around Generation Y about should we embrace culture. It's kind of, it's a given. It's a given. You know, that there are some pretty, across the board, fundamental assumptions of intercultural value. And there are some challenges for managers of Generation Y people too, particularly the idea that people want to be praised and recognised and fast-tracked. So where does this leave coaching? And you can read this for yourself, but I think it's this bit about reading the game, reading the whole individual in the context of their cultural influences, not assuming that they're made up of their cultural influence, that they are people, they are individuals. So just one way of getting your head around what we might need to do as coaches is to ask ourselves this question: are we cultural critics or cultural learners? And a cultural critic is essentially somebody who will take a view that says one cultural view is right and the others compare badly against it, or difference alone is a bad thing, as opposed to a cultural learner whose attitude and worldview is one of saying we need to be consistently and incrementally learning more and more about different cultural influences and learning. There are some things which are really in common between coaching and intercultural learning, I would say, and these are three of them. If you take yourself to be a cultural learner, you do have, in general, a belief in people's resourcefulness, which is an underpinning attitude for coaching, as those of you who've experienced it will know. You need to believe that people can make changes. There's an underpinning respect of positive regard for people. And there's a commitment to developing trusting, open and positive relationships. So this is where I think coaching and intercultural learning have really good ground and really good sort of traction together. So here we go. This I think is where we've got some very, very practical things which we can do as coaches, whether we're coaching directly or we are training people to coach. And it's based on these 5 universal learning requirements. So the assumption here is that there are 5 ways in which we all need to learn. But we can go about it in lots of different ways, dependent on our cultural preference. So number 1, we all need insight. We all need, if we're going to make change for ourselves, we're going to learn about ourselves in a coaching context, we need some personal insight. Feedback is one great way of getting it, but as we've just discussed, it's not for everybody. Feedback doesn't work in the same way for everybody. So you might want to try some different things. Get people to do some self-reflection, for example, rather than just give them some feedback. Give them some role models to learn from. Engage with them at a theoretical level, because some people like that, as opposed to just being told just being given feedback. Even creative techniques can help people draw insight about themselves. I say even creative techniques. You might get from that a sort of bias of my own. I find that a bit uncomfortable. But nonetheless, I know that a lot of people work very creatively in coaching, and creative techniques can help people to learn about themselves. So insight, several approaches to helping people gain insight. People need motivation to change and develop, otherwise they won't do it. So this is universal, but when we coach and train coaches, we can help them to create that insight by understanding the different cultural influences on how they might want to express and acquire motivation. So for example, if we just compare cultures which are individualistic with cultures that are collective, we might think about our approach to how they might want to gain motivation. Are they trying to achieve for themselves, for example, or are they trying to achieve for the benefit of their communities? What is the motivation? Capability. Everybody needs some skills and knowledge to learn, and culturally we do this in very different ways. So some capabilities you'll see are regarded as important virtually everywhere, and some things really vary. Risk-taking is an interesting one. In some cultures, it's great to say, let's say you're coaching somebody, it might be great in an American culture, for example, to say, go out and try it. Go out and take this back to your team, whole new way of working, whole new set of behaviours, and there's a possibility or probability they might even embrace that because they like risk-taking. And risk-taking is culturally supported. Better to ask for forgiveness than permission, in a risk-taking culture. Other cultures, not at all happy with risk-taking, and if you make a mistake, you can be punished for it. So you may have to bear that in mind when you're helping people to think about being effective. Everybody needs to be able to practice their learning in the real world to see what effect their learning has had and to check if they're doing the right things. Risk-taking will come into this. Some people will have to have real assurance that there is a real theoretical underpinning to what they're being asked to take risks about before they'll take a risk. And they might risk, because of that, paradoxically, paralysis by analysis. Need to do too much theory and not enough action. You may have experienced some of this. And the fifth requirement is accountability. If you want people to be learning, they have to be accountable to something or someone. It might be to themselves, or it might be to their organisation, or it might be to their culture or their society. But without that sense of accountability, why are they going to be effective in their learning? Just a point here that depending on culture, some accountability is made very clear. In some cultures you have a contract, don't you? And it's a very thick contract, and everything is laid out very specifically. And in other cultures, that can be seen as an insult. Don't you trust me? Might be the question. I've shaken your hand. Don't you trust me? So we need to be aware of that dimension. But we still need, however we approach it, to be in coaching, to be encouraging and helping people to identify accountability.